Let's dive right into this explainer. We're tracing a sweeping 250-year epic of how British industrial history was literally forged. We're going to look at the fascinating, honestly pretty turbulent relationship between the state and the incredible heavy engineering firms that built the machinery of the modern world.
We're charting a journey that takes us all the way from tiny, smoky 18th century blacksmith forges right up to the construction of colossal modern nuclear submarines. And what's absolutely amazing here is that this immense evolution, going from hand-hammering steel for cutlery to casting massive components for the world's most advanced defense systems, well, it's a continuous thread of engineering legacy. It's largely rooted in just a few historic sites right in the north of England.
Now, the core conflict we're exploring today is super fascinating. We usually just assume governments hold all the cards, right? But our sources reveal this wild story of how independent, fiercely profit-driven merchants actually managed to wrangle control, exert influence, and essentially dictate terms to their biggest, most difficult, and frankly, most demanding customer. And that customer was the British government itself.
Section 1. Origins of Giants, Two Fierce Rivals. Let's start by looking at the origins of the two industrial powerhouses that would eventually dominate the global armaments trade.
There is a really stark contrast between the DNA of our two main subjects here. On one side, we've got William Armstrong. This guy was a lawyer turned engineer, a brilliant, patriotically motivated problem solver from Newcastle who actually started out pioneering hydraulic cranes for dockyards. On the flip side, we have the Vickers brothers, Thomas and Albert. Born into a Sheffield steel dynasty, these two were highly commercially savvy, internationally focused businessmen. Albert was even a skilled linguist who spent years traveling all over Europe and America just striking deals. So two entirely different DNA profiles heading straight for a collision course.
Tracing the Vickers timeline, we see them evolve from 1820s cutlery and file steelmakers into serious heavy industrial players. By 1863, they had moved to the famous River Don Works in Brightside, Sheffield, and, spoiler alert, that site is still incredibly relevant today. Driven by the need for larger markets, by 1888 they made this massive leap from just pouring steel to manufacturing complete guns and armor plating.
Section 2. Entering the arms trade, building weapons. The crucial point here is how these civilian metalworkers and crane builders ultimately found themselves building weapons of war.
Armstrong's pivot to artillery is legendary stuff. Prompted by British artillery failures in the Crimean War, he designed a vastly superior rifled breechloader back in 1855. Patriot that he was, he just handed his patents over to the nation, got knighted for it, and the government essentially created the Elswick Ordnance Company to build his guns, handing him a wildly lucrative monopoly. But, well, the state was a notoriously fickle partner. Just 3 years later, after using Armstrong to completely modernize their own royal arsenal at Woolwich, the government abruptly terminated his contract. Just like that. Armstrong was suddenly cast adrift and forced to figure out how to survive independently in the totally ruthless international arms market.
Meanwhile, Vickers was having their own baptism by fire. Facing a severe global market slump in the 1880s, Albert Vickers realized they had to diversify to survive. And they didn't just inch into the armaments trade, they aggressively bought their way in. They started making artillery, scooped up the famous Maxim Gun Company, and bought the naval construction company at Barrow and Furness. Basically, Vickers was building a powerful, vertically integrated, and fiercely independent empire of their very own.
Section 3. A wary relationship between state and industry. This brings us to the complex, constantly shifting power dynamic between these heavily armed, independent firms and the British state itself. Now, it is so tempting to use that famous American term, the military-industrial complex, to describe what was happening here. But our sources show that's actually a misapplication. The British relationship was definitely not some cozy, seamless alliance. It was actually defined by constant friction, stolen patents, bitter disputes over royalties, and deeply defensive behavior on both sides. The British Treasury operated on a strict laissez-faire policy. They offered zero subsidies for research and development. The firms took on literally all the financial risks, and the state, well, they only bought what they liked, exactly when they liked.
So viewing this through the lens of political science theory, we can see that to survive a buyer that held all the cards, a monopsony, these firms had to develop immense power. And they did this in 3 specific ways. First, they exerted relational power by aggressively lobbying and out-negotiating the state to win contracts. Second, they used agenda-setting power to keep negative issues like harsh profit caps or restrictive export controls entirely off the parliamentary agenda. And eventually, they aimed for ideological power.
They basically tried to create an environment where the government unquestioningly viewed the financial health of Vickers and Armstrongs as utterly identical to British national security. However, the outbreak of the Great War in 1914 threw absolutely all of this out the window. It forced complete state control over the industry. The situation is brilliantly summarized by a dramatic realization from Armstrong's chairman, John Meade Faulkner, in 1915. He recognized that, in the face of total war, the firms had temporarily lost all of their corporate independence. Instead of private enterprise, they had become, effectively, just an arm of the state.
Section 4. The Great Merger of Vickers-Armstrongs. But as we know, wars end, and after the Great War, abruptly canceled contracts and a massively depressed global market forced a historic shift in the late 1920s.
Both of these firms were absolutely bleeding money. The only way forward was a mammoth merger, creating Vickers-Armstrongs and unifying their steel interests into the English Steel Corporation. But to keep their massive factories running, their product line became almost absurdly diverse. I mean, think about this. They were manufacturing massive warships and submarines right alongside everyday hacksaws, railway springs, and even golf club heads, whatever kept the lights on.
But making weapons is never just a regular business, is it? In the 1930s, Vickers-Armstrongs faced fierce public criticism. They were branded as rogue merchants of death, accused of literally fomenting conflict just to reap the profits. This whole backlash led to the 1935 Banks Royal Commission. But what's really fascinating here is that with the dark shadow of World War II rapidly approaching, the newly formed firm and the British government actually found themselves tightly aligning. The government had to step up and defend the private firms, realizing they absolutely needed this independent industrial capacity if they were going to survive a war with Germany. So together, they fended off public demands for total nationalization.
Section 5. Modern Legacy, the Industrial Foundation. Why this history matters today is incredibly evident when we look at the legacy left by these steelmaking dynasties on modern British defense infrastructure.
Let's follow the timeline of Sheffield Forgemasters. This company still operates on the exact historic River Don site that Vickers moved into way back in 1863. We can witness their continued evolution right up to the modern era. Born from the merger of those legacy sites in 1983, they grew into a manufacturer capable of producing the world's largest single steel casting in 2006, a massive 325-ton component. But the financial and strategic stakes of this kind of ultra-heavy engineering ultimately led to a huge landmark moment in 2021, when the company was fully acquired and nationalized by the UK Ministry of Defence. And that brings us to this truly staggering number. A £1.3 billion government-backed recapitalization investment is currently transforming that historic Sheffield site. It perfectly highlights how a 250-year-old private enterprise, one born from independent, fiercely profit-seeking steelmakers, has finally become a vital, fully integrated cornerstone of the modern British state. The arc from pure laissez-faire independence to total state integration is now complete.
To wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on. As we see total state acquisition happening today to guarantee defense supply chains, can strict government ownership actually sustain the same fierce, independent innovation and risk-taking that originally defined pioneers like Armstrong and the Vickers brothers? It's a delicate balance between security and innovation, and honestly, it's a question that is going to define the next 250 years of industrial history. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive.